You are listening to the BBNI podcast, Journeys of Faith, Leadership and Life.
Welcome to the BBNI podcast. I'm Lisa Keys, Chief Officer of the Northern Ireland Boys Brigade, and our podcast is about sharing stories of faith, of leadership and of life, because I believe that God has given each one of us a wonderful story, and sharing these stories can inspire and encourage others. At the core of everything that we do in BBNI, we strive to advance Christ's kingdom, sharing Jesus with children and young people every week. So I'm delighted today to welcome David Blevins, who is no stranger to BB, having just finished an 8-year term as District President for the Boys Brigade in Northern Ireland. And David, you also attended 6th Portadown, you were a captain there as well, and you were Battalion President. So welcome, David. So lovely to have you in the podcast studio today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So David, for the last 8 years, you have served as president of BB here, but we also know you as a senior correspondent for Sky News. You've been recognised by the Royal Television Society for your coverage of the Omagh bombing. You've won widespread commendation for your balanced and impartial journalism, and last year you received an honorary doctorate from Ulster University for your outstanding contribution to journalism, education and charitable projects in Northern Ireland. So I must admit to being slightly nervous today, because as far as interviewing goes, you are the master and now I get to interview you. Although I have been looking forward to doing this for quite some time. But for those who haven't had the pleasure of actually meeting you in person, tell us a little bit about yourself.
How much do you want to know? I am married to Ruth. We've been married for almost 29 years. We have 3 grown-up children. Sarah, who's 25. She and her husband Josh live in Rhode Island in the United States with their 2 little girls, Clover, who has just turned 3, and Cece, who is almost 1. And then James and Mia are here. That's our eldest son. He's here in Northern Ireland, and they have a little boy who's just 4 months. And then we have James is 23, and then Josh, our youngest, the baby, is 19, believe it or not.
Not a baby.
Makes us feel old. And he is studying business in Portadown. And that's family. I'm an identical twin. Lots of people may not know that. My brother is in education. He has been a principal of a primary school. He's been a while with the inspectorate, and he's now going back to be principal of another primary school. He's decided to end his career, he says, back in the school environment. And as you say, I've been with Sky for too long. 27 years I've been with Sky as a reporter, then a correspondent, now a senior correspondent, and the senior bit just means that I'm getting really old, Lisa.
Oh, I don't
but
think so.
That's kind of a little bit about me, and I come from Portadown. Obviously, you say 6th Portadown Boys Brigade, and even though work has taken me all over the world, Portadown is still home. And it feels like home. We live in quite a rural part of Portadown, outside the town on the Dungannon side, and so that means when I'm off, I feel like I'm off.
Yeah, well, that's lovely, and I'm sure getting off sometimes is hard to do, so you really do need to feel that you're off and get a wee bit of space. David, we've talked over the years about lots of things, but I'd really like to hear a little bit more about the career as a journalist, because that's probably not the thing that has been the focus of any of our conversations, just working together in BB. And you have interviewed prime ministers, you've interviewed presidents, politicians, and also ordinary everyday people who for some reason are making the news. And you've covered tragedies, you've covered life-changing moments and everything in between that. But there must have been some highlights and some real low points and some surprises from the people that you've interviewed. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think we're always intrigued by what goes on maybe behind the camera that we don't see.
It has certainly been diverse, as you say, from highs to lows. The journey even here in Northern Ireland, from the conflict through the peace process and all of the historical moments that came along with that. historical became a bit overused in our dictionary, but that itself has been a privilege to have a front row seat on all of that developing. And they say journalism is the first draft of history, so it's been a privilege to be drafting history. I've interviewed 2 American presidents, 3 Irish presidents, 5 British Prime Ministers and 6 Irish Prime Ministers, and every First and Deputy First Minister since the Good Friday Agreement. I also had the privilege of meeting the late Queen Elizabeth on 3 occasions, although I didn't interview her. Her Majesty didn't do interviews as such. And people often ask me who left the greatest impact. And the answer is always the same: none of the above.
Okay.
It may seem a bit cliched, but it really is the ordinary people who have quite extraordinary stories to tell, who leave an impression on you. Those are the people you think about when you put your head on the pillow at the end of the day. People like Michael McGoldrick, who 24 hours after his son had been murdered by loyalist paramilitaries in Portadown at the height of the Drumcree standoff back in the mid to late 90s, told me that he forgave his son's killers and would pray for them.
Wow.
You don't forget moments like that. People like Michael Gallagher, who speaks so graciously and eloquently for the bereaved and injured in Omagh, and we've journeyed with Michael since that horrific day back in 1998, and I would say Michael's become a friend as a result of that. There are so many people like that who come to mind, who just inspire you by their grace. The other family that I think of quite often are the Cardys, whose daughter was abducted and murdered, and it took a very long time for them to obtain justice. And on the day Robert Black was finally convicted of murdering their child, I think it was nearly 30 years later, they took a little while to come out of the court to give the press conference on the steps. And when they did come out, Jennifer Cardy's mother explained to us, apologised to the media for the delay, which she didn't have to do, but said they had taken some time as a family in the courtroom before they left to pray for Robert Black.
Wow.
And then she said, to the shock of so many of my colleagues, that murder and evil and violence was no match for the grace of their God.
What an amazing testimony.
And I've never forgotten that statement. It was really powerful. Mrs. Cardy herself is no longer with us, but what a legacy of grace. And I think it's when grace shines through the most difficult of moments, those are the things you remember far more than the big names or the glamorous names, although it's a privilege to meet them, and it's nice to say you've done so. I have one funny story about when I first interviewed President Clinton. He was coming to Ballybunion to play golf, and we were told that he was not doing any interviews. This was a leisure trip to the west coast of Ireland, but we thought we'll go and get some pictures of him playing golf anyway. We went down to the west coast of Ireland, and just before he arrived, I noticed that they were lining up the officials from the golf club to shake his hand, and they were all in the same uniform. It was a navy blazer and stone chinos, and I was in a navy blazer and stone chinos. So I joined the end of the line discreetly, and as he came along and shook my hand, my cameraman behind me stepped forward. I produced a microphone and we proceeded to interview President Clinton.
Wow.
Who was not doing interviews that day. There you are.
Taking the opportunity.
Yeah.
So David, we've worked together for the past 2.5 years now, and in that time I have heard you speak very fondly of your family. And I know that, like every family, you've had your fair share of heartache as well. You sadly lost your dad when you were 12. I know that your sister had a huge impact on your life. And I just wonder, how has your experience of home life shaped the home life that you've created for your children and your grandchildren?
That makes me sound like I have been an ideal parent in some way, and I have not. I tell people often, because of the job I do, which is so unpredictable, and also the fact that I've had this role in Boys Brigade, and I also chair a board of governors, that I've spent my life, dropping the ball, and Ruth spent her life catching it for me. It's
Teamwork.
Absolutely about partnership, Lisa, and I think perhaps I learned that from my parents. My father did die very young. He was just 46 when he died of cancer, and Stephen and I were just 12. But my father was a bit of a gentle giant, very steady as she goes kind of man, a quiet faith, but nothing fazed him.
Okay.
He was very solid in his faith, whereas my mother was the real visionary, always pushing for, more youth work, and she was a Sunday school superintendent for 25 years and all of that kind of stuff. So I think it was that combination that I learned something from, because I think I'm probably more like my mother in terms of seeing where we might go wherever I'm serving, but I'm reminded then of my father's steadiness and the need to just take time and be measured in how you think things through. So I would think the partnership they had in their marriage has taught me something, even in terms of, I describe Ruth and I as good cop, bad cop at home sometimes, and we reverse those roles at times, but it's a partnership. It's about partnership. And you talk about my sister Ruth. She certainly did inspire us. Ruth was born deaf and partially blind, eventually went completely blind, and was non-verbal. That's because my mother had contracted German measles when she was pregnant. And Ruth was 5 years older than Stephen and I, so we grew up right alongside her. And people say to me, how did you learn sign language? And I would say, I don't remember learning sign language. It's like asking you, do you remember learning to speak?
It's just the normal.
It was normal. The only way we could communicate with Ruth was through sign language. But as I said at her funeral, and I've said it since at a Boys Brigade event, Ruth was blind but saw things the rest of us couldn't see, and she was deaf but heard things the rest of us can't hear, and she was non-verbal, but her life just spoke volumes about the grace of God in that she had this incredibly fulfilled life. 36 years she worked in Craigavon Hospital, despite her limitations that she had. And then very suddenly she left us almost 2 years ago, and we think of her often, but again, it's a bit like my father. She may be gone, but the legacy lives on, and the impact lives on, I think, in her brothers and in all her nieces and nephews, who all talk very fondly about Auntie Ruth, and will even at times speak to one another in sign language to remember how they used to communicate with her. So all of that shapes you as a person, I think.
And that's an amazing testament, isn't it, to how someone just uses what they have, isn't limited by what other people would see as limitations, and just uses what they have to impact and leave a legacy on other people's lives,
Ruth was just so determined to live a full and active life, and my mother was very determined that she would have every opportunity to do that, and so she would go swimming, she would go horse riding, and even when she lost her sight completely, she still had I used to say she had a better social life than all of her brothers combined, because she went to the Deaf Club, and she went to the Eagle Christian Fellowship, and she went to the Disabled Christian Fellowship. She had all of these different groups that she attended, and was even out socialising with a friend on the evening she became ill and died very suddenly. So a full and active life to the end, and very cheerful and upbeat, and an incredible memory. And that's why I say she could hear things the rest of us couldn't hear, the longing of every human heart to really matter to people, because Ruth never forgot a birthday. Wow. Never ever forgot a birthday. She had a kind of photographic memory for birthdays, and it was a real thing in our family, that when you wakened in the morning, Ruth would tell you whose birthday it was, even if she hadn't seen the person for 30 years, she would remember it was their birthday.
That's fantastic. David, we've said there, you're an accomplished journalist, but yet you studied music at Trinity College of Music in London, and you've also considered a slightly different career path at one stage. Can you share something about that? Because we just see you as David the journalist. that maybe wasn't always going to be the case.
At least it's all on the arts end of the spectrum, music and English and journalism. I do play the piano. I used to be very involved in leading worship, not so much these days. In fact, I don't play the piano anywhere near as often as I should, because it's very leisurely, it's very therapeutic. And there's a piano at home, but I don't play it very much. I did consider a career in teaching for a long time. I thought I would end up teaching music. I thought perhaps I would end up teaching English, because that was my other big passion. And in the end, I kind of decided not to go into teaching because I couldn't endure what I had given to the teachers. I was rather unruly in school at times. You may not believe that, but it's true. And I decided not to do that. Interestingly, my twin brother did pursue that path, and I pursued journalism. But it's such a long story. It would take forever to explain it, but through a number of short-term mission trips to Africa, I felt that I wanted to explore a sense of calling, if you like, on my life. And I took a career break and went to the Irish Bible Institute, which is a constituent college, or it was in those days, of the University of Wales. And I did a BA degree in applied theology. And people ask why applied theology, and it's because they describe it as the head, heart and hands degree. It's not just about head knowledge, it's about your own spiritual development in your heart, and it's about figuring out where you serve as well with your hands. And of course, you can imagine when I stepped out of Sky for 3 years, the newspapers completely decided I was going to be ordained as a minister, or I was going to become a missionary. Mm-hmm. Journalist swaps microphone for pulpit was kind of the headline, which was never really a decision that had been taken. I just wanted to pursue this sense of calling, and it was so good because we studied things like pastoral care for people emerging from a conflict situation. How much does that apply to the job I do? We studied all of the faiths of the world, what other people believe, which is so important if we're going to try and communicate what we believe today to other people around us in this very pluralistic society we live in. So all of that was very useful. But at the end of the process, when I was figuring out, what exactly am I going to do with this calling, Sky were very keen that I would return. Okay. And I did return. And I believe that journalism is my calling. I've come to the conclusion that journalism is my high calling in many ways, because it is an industry in which there is not, that it hasn't got a good press, excuse the pun, in recent years. And social media hasn't helped with that regard, in that everyone thinks they're a journalist now.
Absolutely. And it's so immediate.
And whether it's, and we see it from the White House to Downing Street, there's a kind of, if they don't want to broadcast the truth, it's a kind of attack on the media. President Trump calling the media the enemies of the people, for example. So I have a passion about redeeming reporting, is how I describe it. Mm-hmm. We've got to redeem reporting, and that means gathering the news ethically and reporting it with integrity. That's my calling. And so I am applying the theology, not in the pulpit, not on a mission field somewhere abroad. I think I'm ministering within the media, not in the sense that I'm trying to convert my audience. That's not what my job is when I'm doing my job. But I am applying, I suppose, I hope, grace and ethics and integrity to the job that I do, or I try to do.
And that, I suppose, is part of the essence of these podcasts. It's actually sharing stories to help inspire others, that God is putting them in situations and equipping them for the next stage of their journey. And I think that's where these podcasts can maybe help just inspire people and show them that there are other routes, there are other ways, and there are ways to serve God in the here and now, in the industry that you've called to be in.
We live in a really difficult time, I think, in terms of not just the pluralistic society, but the antagonism towards Christianity in particular, because it can be perceived as something that's very boxing in, very much about rules and regulations. That's not my lived experience in any shape or form. It's about life in all its fullness, and learning how to engage with the society we find ourselves in is so important these days. And I hang on often to words of my own pastor, Phil Emerson, where he says, "Trust what you carry, David. Trust what you carry. It isn't always necessary, as people think, to speak out.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about just being there, about making sure that your body language and the vibe is right, and people just sense something different about you that causes them to say, where do you get this peace from, or where do you get this grace from? Because that opens the conversation without you having to force that conversation.
So, David, that actually leads us very nicely into this next question. And we've talked a little bit about grace, and I have worked with you over this last 2 years on all things related to BB. And I have seen the incredible grace that you have shown, particularly in difficult meetings, and there have been some. But I've also seen you pause and take time to listen to others. And when you received your honorary doctorate from Ulster University last year, you made a speech, and the essence of that led to a TED talk. And that was earlier this year. And I want to quote 2 statements from that TED talk, if you don't mind. So one of them was, in a world of full stops, we need more commas. And the other one was, it is the power of a comma that turns a no to yes. And David, I don't believe you just made those statements as part of a talk, because I have seen you live that. I have seen you firsthand live that. I've been in meetings with you where sometimes you have literally just sat back and paused. And I've actually taken my cue from you, because with me sometimes I jump in and I just want to get all this stuff out there. But I've seen you actually take time to pause, and that has changed totally the dynamics and the direction of the meeting and the outcome. But I wonder, where did that posture of pausing and taking time to listen come from?
Trial and error, maybe.
Okay.
I talked about my parents a short time ago, but I, in my youth, was quite feisty at times. I would recognise that now. I wasn't always the person who paused. And I've learned from that, I think, over time. And I don't just credit my father's personality for that. I also credit my wife, Ruth, because she has always been very good at saying, when I want to reply to a text message, write the reply, but don't send it until tomorrow morning. And 9 times out of 10, I don't send it. Okay. And that's something I've learned in terms of replying to emails as well. Write the reply, get it out of your system, but don't hit send. And more often than not, you will seriously change it the next morning, because you reach a point where you recognise that you don't claim the high ground by fighting back. And grace is actually far more powerful. It is far more powerful than victory. And that's, I suppose, what I've learned. And when I talk about the comma, I use 3 examples really. The comma means you have to pause. And when was the last time we paused to reflect before we just pushed forward our opinion? We're very quick to believe what we believe is right.
Yeah.
And that may not be the case. So be slow to speak and quick to listen. It's about pausing for long enough to actually consider another person's point of view. And sometimes the best thing to do is go for a cup of coffee with a person who has a completely different point of view. Yeah. And try to find a little bit of common ground. The pause, the comma also gives us an opportunity to clarify things. We know that from grammar. If a comma is missing, the sentence can mean something completely different. So whenever you take that pause, then you can begin to clearly see another person's opinion and what's behind that opinion and what has shaped them to believe what they believe. And it just becomes a far more productive conversation rather than an argument. And ultimately, the comma also means the story isn't finished. There's an opportunity to finish well. And that's why I have hung on to this idea that the world's full of full stops. You know, we're orange or we're green, full stop. We are conspiracists or we're scientists, full stop. Whatever the case may be, in the church, it's even more the case where we box ourselves in. Let's have fewer full stops, more commas and more space to think and get to understand each other better.
That's certainly something that we all can take on board, and even just that, not replying in the haste, and that's something I've been guilty of, and I think we all are. But just taking that time to understand, so I think that's probably something that we all can take from that. David, just as we move towards the end of this, and look, I could sit and chat to you all day, but when the pandemic first hit in 2020, I wasn't actually working for Boys Brigade at the time. I only started in 2021, and I was within industry and in the business circles that I operated in. I remember many business leaders saying that time the only way that we're going to emerge from the pandemic in a sustainable way is to have courage and courageous leadership. And David, this is probably the last formal time maybe that I will get to sit opposite you in our current roles as you step down from being president, but you have demonstrated such courageous leadership in these last 8 years. And central to that courage has been your unshakable trust and reliance on God. And a verse that you have reminded us in BB so many times is Joshua 1 and verse 9. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And we're moving into a new season for Boys Brigade Northern Ireland. We move forward in a much, much better place thanks to the courageous leadership and the people who have come alongside on the journey that you have led. So what encouragement would you now leave for us as we move forward?
When I was elected district president, it was not the 8 years I anticipated, but it was the 8 years God anticipated. I recognise that. And our ways are not his ways. His ways are better and wiser and greater than ours, and he can see the end of the journey when we only see the beginning. So one of the things I said at the very beginning was that I was going to listen, and I really did listen. And I discovered quite quickly that the loudest voices in any organisation are not always the most representative voices. And so I widened the number of people I listened to. And one of the pieces of advice I would give to anyone is listen to as many people as possible, especially people who feel a little disenfranchised, who are on the fringes, who feel they don't hold high office, they don't sit on any committee, they just want to advance Christ's kingdom among boys. But they've years of experience of doing that. They have got a vision for where they want to go in the future. Their voices were so necessary. And when we actually rallied them to a cause, they rallied like never before in defence of the gospel, which has absolutely thrilled my soul, because it's what fuels my hope for the Boys Brigade in Northern Ireland in the future. Someone shared recently with me from James chapter 4, and this I think is what I would say in terms of advice. God is sovereign. James tells us, don't waste your time quarrelling. In fact, it's arrogant to do that, because your life is just a vapour. God is sovereign. Where we are today is where God has brought us, not where David Blevins has brought us or Lisa Keys has brought us. God is sovereign. But God is also jealous, that same verse tells us. He's jealous for the spirit that he has placed within us. God doesn't want us to live with one foot in each camp. He wants us to be sold out for him, to be sold out for the business of advancing Christ's kingdom. So he's gracious, but he's also jealous. And ultimately, God is gracious, because that chapter says, come near to me and I will come near to you. And I think that's the journey God has brought us on in Boys Brigade. We have never prayed as much about anything as we have prayed about where we are going in the Boys Brigade in Northern Ireland. And God has drawn close to us. He has united us. He has given us a miracle in terms of the positive conclusion to a very lengthy and complex negotiation. So I think the three things I would say is, remember the sovereignty of God. Everything is in his hands, not ours. Remember the jealousy of God. He wants all of our hearts, not just a part of it. He doesn't want a surface level religion. The Boys Brigade is about advancing Christ's kingdom. We can't introduce anyone to Jesus unless we know Jesus ourselves. And ultimately, God is gracious enough that when we come close to him, he will come close to us.
David, thank you, not just for this podcast, for sharing with us today, but just on behalf of the current boys and children and young people that attend Boys Brigade and those that will attend in the future, and the leaders. Thank you most sincerely for how you have listened to God in the last 8 years when you've been serving, and for the position we're now in. And we look forward to a bright future. We're expectant for God to move, to change lives and to win souls through how he uses all of us, our incredible 2,300 volunteer leaders. And we know that you'll always be a friend of Boys Brigade. It's been in your heart and in your life for so many years. And we just want to say thank you most sincerely, and thank God for placing you where he placed you for such a time as this. So thank you, David, for being with us today. Thank you for sharing in this podcast. We know that what has been shared will really inspire and encourage people, not just leaders, but beyond the Boys Brigade network. So thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you for listening to the BBNI podcast. Subscribe to us on wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to joining with you next time.